Welcome. Good evening. My name is Karen Wright-Marsh. I'm the Executive Director of Theological Horizons, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to today's CAPS lecture in Christian Theology with Jonathan Merritt. So on behalf of the Project on Lived Theology here at the University of Virginia and its director, Charles Marsh, and from all of us at Theological Horizons, we're so happy that you're here. A few notes as we begin. Tonight's lecture is being live streamed on Facebook, and it's at the Theological Horizons Facebook page, and we'll be posting it on the Theological Horizons website, so you can go back and see this evening's lecture again. I invite you to complete cards you may find around in your seat or in the back to sign up, so we can invite you to more events like this one, and leave it in baskets at the exits. Signed copies of Jonathan Merritt's book will be for sale at the back of the hall following the lecture, signed copies. And following Mr. Merritt's lecture, which we expect to last 45 to 50 minutes, following his lecture, we will have time for question and answer, and we expect to conclude by 7:30. So I'd like to take a moment to say a warm word of gratitude to Dr. and Mrs. W. Jerry Capps. Thanks to their generosity, the Capps Lecture Series has brought eminent Christian thinkers to the heart of the university since 2001 to explore the relationship between faith and responsibility. Which brings us to today and our theme of Speaking God, the Death and Rebirth of Sacred Speech. I know of no better contemporary guide into our present moment than Jonathan Merritt, an award-winning writer in religion, culture, and politics. He's been named one of the 30 young influencers reshaping Christian leadership, and Jonathan holds a Master of Divinity from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and a Master of Theology from Emory University's Candler School of Theology. But Jonathan Merritt has more than an education. He has seen this world of American Christianity from the inside. He is a Southern Baptist preacher's kid. Just found out his father was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is legit, and has spent time himself as a pastor in the church, and has living currently in Brooklyn, where he contributes regularly to television, print, and radio news outlets. Mr. Merritt now serves as a contributing writer for The Atlantic and publishes in respected outlets from the Washington Post and Christianity Today to USA Today and BuzzFeed. His op-ed entitled, "It's Getting Harder to Talk About God," was in this past Sunday's New York Times and received 1,356 online comments, and that was just within a day of its publication. So you're hot, apparently. Jonathan is the author of several critically acclaimed books, and I commend them all to you, including Jesus is Better Than You Imagined and A Faith of Our Own, Following Jesus Beyond the Culture Wars. Publishers Weekly called his book Green Like God, mandatory reading for churchgoers. His latest work is Learning to Speak God from Scratch. Reviewers have praised Jonathan Merritt for reviving ancient expressions through cultural commentary, vulnerable personal narratives, and surprising biblical insights. Activist Shane Claiborne thanks Jonathan Merritt for reminding us that Jesus has survived all the embarrassing things that we Christians have done in his name. He shows you, Shane says, the Jesus who challenges the chosen, includes the excluded, assaults closed minds, opens hard hearts, and defies all the boxes, categories, and camps to show us who God is and what love looks like with skin on. The author Rachel Held Evans writes that Jonathan Merritt invites us to move beyond legalism, beyond cynicism, and beyond fear to the feet of Jesus, where love always prevails. At a time when the very meaning of Christianity is contested and talk about religion is fraught, I think we're all longing to believe that love indeed will prevail. And so this afternoon, as we come together here at the University of Virginia, as believers and seekers from across many traditions, we look to the way ahead in the good company of Jonathan Merritt. Welcome, Jonathan.
I think we are on. Test, test. Oh, there we are. Can you hear me now? All right. Well, I was in college just a couple of hours drive from here the first time that I went with Mindy to the movie theater. It was also coincidentally the first time I remember almost being jailed for homicide, because Mindy is what I call a movie talker. Any of you know movie talkers? Somebody who seemingly doesn't realize they're in a crowded theater where everybody else is as quiet as rocks, because they proceed to talk from the opening credits to the closing credits. When she was the slightest bit confused, she would ask what was happening at full volume, of course. When she was the slightest bit scared, she would verbalize her fear with shrieks and instructions to don't go in there, or, well, that was a bad idea. In the span of 2 hours, Mindy commented on a range of things. How adorable she thought the costumes were, whether I wanted a refill of soda from the concession stand. She griped about the lady sitting in front of us because the lady sitting in front of us was griping about how loud she was being. And by the time the movie finally ended, I'd worked up a pretty good mad, and I thought, well, I'm not going to say anything, it's over. But then I thought of all of you. Moviegoers across America who were relying on me in that moment to confront her. And so I did. I said, Mindy, I know you like to talk in movie theaters, but could you please, in the future, limit your amount of comments, and if you have to make them, could you whisper them? And then something happened that I'll never forget. She said with a flip of her hair, as if to totally dismiss me, she said, well, as a matter of fact, I can't help it. I'm human. We talk. That's just what we do. And that, my friends, is when I was almost jailed for homicide. Almost, but not. But that was the last time I would go and see a movie with Mindy. But you know, as I've thought about this in the years following that, what my friend said is not completely untrue, is it? We humans talk. That's just what we do. Have you ever wondered why that is? Why it is that we humans communicate, why it is that communication is so unique to the human species. Why is it that human beings talk but other plants and insects and even other animals do not? Sure, bees can buzz their location, seals can honk to signal their delight. Dolphins and apes can be trained to express themselves with sounds. I sometimes think my family's Boston Terrier barks in complete sentences. But there is no other creature on planet Earth who can communicate with the same level of texture and nuance and color and emotion that we humans do with our words. As Reynolds Price says in his fantastic book, A Palpable God, the ability to speak, the ability to use words is so central to who we are as human beings that it comes, catch this, second in necessity, apparently after nourishment, but before love and shelter. Think about that. Many in cities around the world survive without homes and without hugs, but you will not find a civilization that lives in silence. Speaking, that's just what we do. Language is a central and shaping component of the human experience, even before we are born. We now know that sound waves travel fairly well into the mother's abdomen, echoing into the womb in sometimes muffled but clearly audible ways. This is just inconsequential background noise for a baby until the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, when that part of the brain that processes sound is developed. Now, recent studies indicate that infants have already familiarized themselves with their parents' native language by the time of their birth. One study conducted in 1988 showed that newborns could recognize the theme song from their mother's favorite soap opera. A more recent study on fetal learning was conducted by neuroscientists at the University of Helsinki, asking pregnant mothers to speak a made-up word repeatedly during their pregnancy. Using EEG sensors, which test brain activity, researchers found that children upon birth recognize that made-up word and its variations following birth, while a control group of infants did not. The ability to speak and to respond to words is quite literally second nature for human beings. It's hardwired into us before we even take our first breath. It is, as Mindy said, just what we do. The idea that speech is a foundational part of what it means to be human should not be a controversial idea, at least not for those of us who are part of the Christian faith. The centrality of words to the human experience is woven deep into the fabric of our sacred text, beginning with the poetry in the first chapter of Genesis. You'll remember that text in which God creates the world with words. God uses language to form seaweed and roses, caterpillars and cats, riptides and supernovas. But God doesn't stop there. With a whisper, humans arise from dirt, and divine breath inflates lungs. And at this point, so the story goes, God gives human beings a gift. We use a fancy word for this in Latin, the imago Dei, the image of God. Each of us, all of us, male and female, black, brown, and white, citizen and immigrant, Republican and Democrat, capitalist and socialist, gay and straight, cisgender and transgender, all of us at any time bear within us the image of our Creator. But what is that image exactly? Well, theologians have debated this question for centuries, and we're certainly not going to settle the matter in this forum. Some say that the image of God in us is intellect. Others claim it's the ability to reason, and others still contend it is the ability to obey a moral code. But I think another answer that is at least as plausible as those, given the context of the reference in which that phrase appears, is that the image of God in humans is the ability to speak. As one Episcopal writer has said, God could have made us stone creatures or sea creatures or tree creatures or winged creatures, but God made us speech creatures instead. Human beings made in God's own likeness, which is to say, capable of joining God in the work of creation by speaking things into being ourselves. Well, your words may not cause plants to sprout, but they can make hope spring forth in a human heart. The words you choose to use can cause a smile to take shape on a sullen face. It can shake listeners awake, force heads to snap sideways, woo a lover into making a lifelong covenant to share life with you. God birthed us with words, and now we human beings find ourselves in constant labor pains, giving birth to worlds ourselves through the power of our words. Speaking is central to the experience of existence. But speaking is not just a natural act. Speaking is a supernatural act. It is not just a human action, but it can also be a holy action. Not long after the unfortunate experience at the movie theater with Mindy, I stumbled onto a passage of Scripture I'd never read before. Well, maybe I'd read it, but I'd never noticed it. Paul's second letter to the Corinthian church, the apostle writes these words, "As it is written, I believe, therefore I have spoken. And since we have the same spirit of faith," Paul writes, "we also believe, and therefore we speak." One of the most important words in that sentence there is the one that you're most tempted to overlook. It's the word therefore. It's a word in sacred text used to link two disparate, or at least seemingly disparate, ideas to express that a second idea follows a first idea. We believe, therefore we speak. Paul's constructing something of an if-then statement. If you believe, Paul says, then therefore you will speak about that which you believe. So there is a kind of speech, a sacred speech, that people of faith should be engaging in, Paul says. And he's pretty matter-of-fact about it. Well, of course, Paul was not the first person to connect spirituality and speech, belief and articulation, not by a long shot. Though Genesis sets the stage for this concept of speaking God, the rest of the Old Testament develops it further. When Moses descends Mount Sinai, lugging those 2 stone tablets, he is delivering 10 phrases that would become Israel's watchwords. These commandments make for a curious list if you stop to read them. One addresses the need for rest. Another forbids cheating on your spouse. Both good ideas. Stealing is out in one commandment. Another vetoes covetousness and idol-making. Children ordered to honor their parents. But when it comes to words, God issues in this narrative not one command, but two. He doubles up in this story. One prohibits bearing false witness against another person, which is just a fancy way of saying that hate speech, slander, and lying are all bad news. Another commandment forbids people from taking God's name in vain. The message here is simple. Words are too powerful to use without care, especially when you're speaking God. Years after Moses chisels this Decalogue, words continue to play a prominent role in the Jewish tradition. God speakers pass stories and laws between generations long before the invention of pens, parchment, or papyrus. Ancient Israel was, in the phrasing of theologian Walter Brueggemann, a community of utterance. Prophets were deemed faithful or condemned by the words they use or the words they choose to withhold. From the weeping Jeremiah to the dreaming Isaiah, who once envisioned an angel of God cleansing his very lips with a hot coal so that he could speak God well. And who can forget Elijah? It's one of the most fascinating stories in the entire Hebrew Bible. We find this weary prophet climbing up Mount Horeb to meet with Israel's God. Stand on the mountain in front of me, God says in this narrative, and so the prophet stands. And then the story says, a mighty wind swept across the mountain and it tore the rocks apart, but the Lord was not in the wind. And then a rumbling earthquake shook the foundations of that mountain, but God was not in the quake. And then fire descends onto the mountain, sweeping across its face, but God was not in the fire. And when all this settles, God then comes, and God comes in a gentle whisper. In words, God came, the way God so often comes to all of us. When the Christian tradition arises from this word-loving soil, it inherits these ideas from its Jewish sibling. It draws them forward. Jesus would be called by the Apostle John the Word of God, grows into a man before launching his ministry in his hometown synagogue. You'll remember standing in Nazareth, he announces to those listening that he has been anointed by God to proclaim, which is to say, to speak God. The last 3 years of Jesus' life was firstly a ministry of words. He would say, come, follow me. He would say, your faith has healed you. He would say, blessed are the meek. He would say, go and sin no more. And with every proclamation, doors swung wide and lame legs danced and cataracts dissolved into the atmosphere. In fact, Jesus loved language so much, you'll often stumble upon him in the New Testament issuing odes to linguistics. He would teach us that good people should spew life-giving language, that we all will have to justify the way we speak when we cross over, that humans cannot live by bread alone, no, but by nourishment from divine syllables. Well, it's no wonder then that when Jesus gives his last command to his disciples, he says, go therefore into all the world and speak God. Well, the words keep coming after they execute the Messiah, most astoundingly on the day of Pentecost. Of course, the story of Pentecost should not be understood in isolation. It is actually a mirror opposite, a divine reversal, if you will, of another canonical tale, the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. In this story, all people spoke a single language, and they come together to build a tower to reach God. It was a symbol of their pride. It was a symbol of their desire to dominate the earth, to reign supreme. It says they built the tower so they could make a name for themselves. In response, God causes them to speak different languages so that no one can understand each other, and they are forced to disband into tribes that would war against each other. Well, at Pentecost, you see the reverse of this tale. people coming together, speaking a range of tongues, and those from various tribes cannot understand each other. Huddled together in a room that felt like a funeral parlor, a band of distraught disciples sit around in a cloud of defeat. They discussed what they would do next as if anyone knew, and then it happened. A holy wind swept through the room, and they breathed it into their lungs, and when it came out with words they did not know they knew. Strange words, swirling in that room throughout every corner of the neighborhood with such intensity that a crowd comes to investigate. There, people speaking disparate languages find commonality. The linguistic component in these tales, I think, is not incidental but instructive. And what is the lesson? The lesson is when sin reigns, language divides. When the Spirit reigns, language unites. Well, that party on Pentecost eventually dies down, as we all know, but the talking did not cease. These followers of Jesus would traverse to every corner of the globe, nattering on about the Jesus way. In some places, people grew annoyed or even angry at their chatter, but this would not stop them. When they were instructed to sit down and shut up, they replied without hesitation, "We cannot keep from speaking about what we have seen and heard." Consider the major transformative moments in biblical history for a moment. The creation, the Tower of Babel, the calling of Abraham and of Moses, the giving of the Mosaic Law, every prophetic revelation and proclamation, the arrival and the ministry of Jesus, the Great Commission, the day of Pentecost. God could have chosen to usher into any of these moments an infinite number of ways, but God chooses always a linguistic miracle. Why is that? When we meet Paul in 2 Corinthians 4, then, we can only understand the way that he speaks matter-of-factly by understanding the tradition that Paul is speaking from. Paul is drawing on a rich tradition when he knits together spirituality and speech. Throughout the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, belief and articulation are inextricably linked. We believe, therefore we speak. But you know, in a world like ours, that's easier said than done, isn't it? We often struggle to have spiritual or religious conversations with friends and family members, neighbors and coworkers, don't we? 5 years ago, I realized firsthand how hard it can be when I relocated from the Bible Belt to New York City. Prior to the move, I resided in a suburban neighborhood outside of Atlanta where I served at a church. Almost all my friends were Christian. Most of us believed and behaved similarly. In this world, there was kind of a cultural Christian lingo that many speak, almost everybody else understands. If somebody sneezed, a stranger might say, "God bless you," but the sneezer wouldn't stop and say, "What do you mean by God or bless?" There was no follow-up question needed. You could say you were born again or attended a Bible-believing church, and everybody kind of understood what was coded into that language. So I used religious language with ease, rarely pausing to think about what my words meant, rarely pausing to ask, what am I saying when I'm saying what I'm saying? But I was not in Georgia anymore. No, I was now in New York City. I had been writing about faith and culture for years, but as it turns out, pontificating about post-Christian culture is a lot easier than living in one. In New York, religious fluency is not assumed. The majority of residents attend church not on every given Sunday. As I quickly discovered, many people don't understand the sacred words I'd taken for granted. Others use them with wildly different meanings. I remember my first Sunday in New York, finding myself waiting on a subway platform en route to church. A woman standing next to me asked where I was going. I said I was heading to a worship service, and of course she asked for clarification. I said, well, I was heading to church. She perked up. She said she practiced the Baha'i faith. She held up her crystal amulet necklace and explained it protected her from evil spirits. She said if I was spiritually curious, she could read my chakra and access the invisible energy fields around my body. As we began to talk, this southern boy in New York City began to realize when we were conversing about our respective religious practices, neither of us really understood what the other was saying. She peppered me with questions about God, the Bible, the afterlife, and I fumbled for answers. What came out didn't make much sense. I would try to use words I considered common. Grace, gospel, salvation. My conversation partner would stop me mid-sentence and ask for a definition, please. I'd stutter, stammer, couldn't make much sense of what I thought I believed, at least not in ordinary vernacular. It was like trying to define the word color or thee. Words that I had used often, but I'd never stopped to consider their meanings. When a new friend in a co-working space asked me whether I was like the hypocritical Christians he saw on television, shamelessly stumping for politicians, well, I was drenched in shame. But I could understand his contempt. The way certain people, groups of people, use sacred language gives the rest of us the holy heebie-jeebies. Sacred phrases become tools of manipulation in the hands of angry leaders. They're fashioned into clubs by combative evangelists and transformed into partisan stump speeches by political preachers. When shouted outside of a college football stadium by a man with a bullhorn and a sandwich board, well, even Scripture becomes downright annoying. Soon after moving to New York, I was catching on to a pattern emerging in my conversations. Exchanges flowed freely when I stuck to benign topics like the dreaded winter weather or how loud the jackhammers had grown across the street, but the conversation stalled the moment the subject turned spiritual. To avoid having to define every sacred term, I just swept them into a pile and out the door. Not wanting to be associated with those who spoke God fluently but irresponsibly, I just started avoiding spiritual conversations altogether. And you know what? As it turns out, I am not alone. Because I've been meeting people from all over this country, people in places just like Charlottesville, with similar histories of belief, who too feel they've been struck mute in a strange land. Terms like sin and evil have become so negative they lodge in our throats. Others like belief and salvation, well, we've uttered those so often we don't even know what they mean anymore. Definitions and connotations of words like mercy and love can no longer be assumed. You see, you don't have to move to New York City to feel the tension I have felt, because this world is changing. It is changing north and south, east and west. Every day our lives are saturated with people who differ from us in race and religion, age, education, sexual orientation, and cultural mores. In neighborhoods across America, people don't read from the same script. They don't work with a common spiritual vocabulary. So you will feel this pinch, whether you live in a Rocky Mountain mining town or a Great Plains farm community, in a bungalow overlooking the ocean, or an HOA-friendly house in Charlottesville. I'm guessing most of you can relate, because you gave up a weeknight to come hear me talk about it. Have you run into an awkward language barrier in recent days? Maybe you were spoon-fed religious words since infancy, but now you wonder as you've matured if maybe many of those terms need to mature with you. Maybe you once believed that accepting faith was as simple as praying certain words, and now you know, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Maybe you formerly assumed that using particular words and avoiding others somehow increased your spiritual stature. Maybe the rigid religious tradition that you come from has made you so anxious about speaking God precisely that you end up not speaking God at all. Maybe your parents, your pastors, or your friends have used religious words as weapons to oppress or repress, shame or scold you. Maybe you've been turned off by the sharp syllables of street preachers, the slick pitches of televangelists, or the trite words of pious politicians. Or maybe you feel guilty speaking God because deep down you only believe God probably exists like on even-numbered days. Maybe you squirm when you hear people use religious language to convert others without ever considering maybe they're the ones who need to be converted. Maybe you still walk into church many weeks, but you object to what you hear while you are there. Well, if that's you, then you are in good company. After my experience moving to New York, I conducted a national survey of more than 1,000 Americans, and you know what I found? I found that tens of millions of Americans, more than 2/3 of us actually, we're not speaking God often. More than 1/5 of Americans admit they have not had a spiritual conversation at all in the last year. Zero, zip, goose egg. Only 7% of Americans, despite the fact that nearly 71% of us claim to be Christian, only 7% of Americans say that they've had a spiritual conversation on a regular basis, about once a week. And here's the real kicker. When it comes to practicing Christians who attend church regularly, the most faithful among us, that number is only 13%. Only 1 in 8 practicing Christians talk about their faith on a regular basis. So millions of Americans now struggle to find sacred language that can adequately describe life's deeper truths. We believe, but we do not therefore speak. We have lost our therefore. And why are so many of us tongue-tied exactly? Well, according to my poll, there are a range of reasons. More than a quarter of people say that religious conversations always seem to create tensions or arguments. And if you've ever been to that Thanksgiving meal where Uncle Philip is shaking that drumstick at you, telling you what the Bible really means, you can understand. Many of us have enough tension in our lives. We don't need to fight over religion. Nearly 20% say they feel religion has become too politicized. Politicians and presidents have been using spiritualized language for decades as dog whistles to secure the loyalty of voters. And by the way, it's not just conservatives who do this, even though they're some of the worst offenders. When spiritual language becomes partisan, people stop using it. In addition to these reasons, people give a range of other reasons. Some say they're embarrassed by the way sacred words have been used in pop culture. Others say they don't want to sound like a religious extremist, particularly popular among millennials. Some say they've been hurt by religious words in the past. For many of us, and for a variety of reasons, religious and spiritual language has become toxic. So I've had many people say to me, let's just let it go. It doesn't matter if we speak God. Talk is cheap anyway. Right? Why don't we just focus on doing instead of speaking? You know, I don't know, there's a quote often attributed to St. Francis that says, preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words. Well, I don't know who said it, but it's one of the worst quotes of all time. If you're a Christian and you're in this room, there is only one reason that you are a Christian, because somebody said something to someone who said something to someone who said something to someone who said something to you. We are speech creatures. Now, those words must be accompanied by visible expressions of those words' transformative power, no doubt. But we cannot preach the gospel without words. There is a false dualism that is quite popular today that divides speaking from doing, and it's about time we're fully honest about it. So often people will make remarks like that to me, that words are cheap, or they'll say, don't say something, do something. Well, of course, this is a partial truth, but it is not the whole truth, so help me God. It's correct that our words should be accompanied by corresponding deeds, but we must also acknowledge that to speak is to do, because words have the power to change things. In the 1960s, the British philosopher of language, J.L. Austin, developed his speech act theory, in which he explained that when a speaker stands before a hearer and emits an acoustic blast, remarkable things occur. There are actually 3 acts involved when anyone speaks, regardless of the subject. There is locution, which is the words a person speaks, illocution, which is the meaning of the words spoken, and then perlocution, which is the result of that speaking, the effect of that speaking, the thing the speaking does. The 20th century French philosopher Hélène Cézanne remarked, "It is said that life and death are under the power of language." While an ancient Hebrew king named Solomon actually beat her to the punch by a couple thousand years, he said, "The tongue has the power of death and life, and those who live it will eat its fruit." A thoughtless word, the wise monarch said, is like the fatal thrust of a sword, while a phrase wrapped in love is medicine. When we speak words, we are doing something. We are encouraging or discouraging, directing or redirecting, harming or healing. You think about your life for just a moment, and you'll realize how true this is. Every person in this room has had their life's path altered by words that were spoken to them or about them or over them. I love you, spoken by the right person at the right moment, will set your heart ablaze. I'm leaving you, particularly when it's spoken by those same lips, well, it can incinerate you into an ash pile. A baby muttering "mama" can soften an anxious mother, while a toddler shouting "help" can panic a father. A college professor's decision to say, "yeah, you can," as opposed to "you'll never succeed," can determine whether a student grows into a sculptor or a scientist. A simple "I'm sorry" has the power to mend what's broken. Perhaps no one in the Jewish tradition knew more about this linguistic power than Solomon's father did, David. When he was a boy and he still smelled of musty lamb's wool, a prophet spoke over him about his destiny as king. When a giant threatened his nation, he spoke defiant words in defense of his people, and then he slayed that giant with stones from a shepherd's bag. Well, you remember the story doesn't end there. David gave up herding sheep for ruling a nation. And then he slung a different kind of stone. Through his psalms, David flung limestone verbs and sandstone nouns and conjunctions made of dolomite. He leveraged words to vent and to lament, to bless and to praise. And those stony psalms skipped across time as generations of Jews recited and sung and prayed them. Hundreds of years, thousands of years after David's body was laid to rest, his words still proved powerful enough to slay the giants of depression and discouragement and bitterness and loss. Millions of God seekers across generations have read the Psalms in a time of need and found that they didn't just speak, they did something. They changed something. They transformed something. Don't tell me words are cheap. But words do not just impact us emotionally, not by a long shot. They also influence us intellectually and morally. An emerging body of research in the field of linguistics now reveals that the language we hear, the words we hear, the words we speak, influence and shapes our worldviews, our memories, our perceptions, our associations far more than we ever realized. Children who grow up speaking the same words think in similar ways, while those who grow up immersed in different languages have dissimilar mental processes. The way we speak shapes the way we think. Linguist Lera Boroditsky and her colleagues found that speakers of Russian, which treat light blue and dark blue as primary colors, distinct from each other, more quickly characterize different shades of blue when they see something. In other words, if I take a Russian-speaking friend down to the Met, he will have a totally different experience than will I. He will notice things in art that I will not, vice versa. But of course, these impacts go well beyond shades of blue. Words also impact our moral minds. Linguistic studies have shown that some languages make one more likely to assign blame than others. In English, we prefer active verb constructions. Sarah wrecked the car, instead of passive. The car was wrecked. If someone asks you to recount an event or recall a memory, your language conditions you to assign agency, even if an action was accidental. But if you speak a language like Japanese or Spanish, the agent of causality is often dropped, even if someone was at fault. If Sarah went on a liquor-fueled bender and wrapped your Honda around a live oak, someone in these contexts might say, the car was wrecked. What is the result? As a result, people who speak languages like English more readily blame others and have developed, and I'm quoting, a criminal justice bent toward punishing transgressors rather than restituting victims. You see, if we let sacred speech die, our eyes will not be attuned to transcendence. Our minds will not be shaped by the divine. Our decisions will not be influenced by faith. Our society will not be shaped by spirituality and its corresponding virtues. Believers like you and me often stop speaking God because we don't like what these words have come to mean, the way they've been used. But when we stay silent, all those people who are causing the problem, they get to hog the microphone. That toothy televangelist will keep using spiritual language to call for yet another private jet. And there will be no one to say, no, actually, faith is not about serving your own desires, but it's about advocating for the least of these. No one will be around to say that because, well, you and I, we've all stopped speaking God. That politician will keep using spiritual language to push xenophobic legislation. And there will be no one to say, no, actually, faith calls us to welcome the stranger, to promote justice and equality. No, they'll dominate the conversation because, well, we've all stopped speaking God. That street preacher who uses spiritual language to peddle the fear of a fiery hell and spew condemnation at passersby, there will be no one to say, no, actually, God loves you because God loves you because God loves you because God loves you, and there is no condemnation for you, no wrath and no anger. No, they will dominate the conversation because, well, we've all stopped speaking God. So many of us have gotten sick over the way religious language has been used, misused, and abused. But in our effort to avoid contributing to the problem, we actually have exacerbated it. You see, the world needs us to speak God. Charlottesville, Virginia, needs you to speak God. But how? How? How do we find our voice again? How do we regain confidence in the language of faith? How do we learn to speak God from scratch? Well, I could say we have books for sale outside that door. But that would be really nasty of me. Instead, I want to give you a thought, something to hang on to. You know, if you come from a fundamentalist tradition, you'll read 2 Corinthians 4 and think, well, another thing for my to-do list. Now I have to go out and love my neighbor and tithe to the church and X, Y, and Z and have a spiritual conversation. Because fundamentalist theology divides the world into to-do lists and to-don't lists. And that sort of is how you judge your own personal righteousness. But I don't think that's at all what Paul is saying when he says we believe, therefore we speak. I think Paul is just telling us about the way the world works. I think Paul is telling us that when we are people who truly believe, we will be people who naturally speak. There's a preacher named Barbara Brown Taylor who once gave a talk called The Virtuous Preacher, in which she said this, and I'm quoting, "The integrity of a speaker matters most. Skills matter, but effective speaking has less to do with what a speaker says than who a speaker is. If you want to speak about faith," she said, "don't just think about tactics for having cornering somebody at a water cooler. Instead, think about the virtues you're nurturing in your own life. Rather than focus on the words, she encourages us to think about the daily disciplines, the private practices, the intentional behaviors that shape us into God speakers. I think she's right. I think there are some key virtues that if we begin strengthening these in our lives, they will help us find our voice again. And I have time to name a few. Speaking God takes courage. Having a spiritual conversation these days is risky. You'll need to be brave. Actually, it's risky to say just about anything these days. You go on Facebook, you talk about kittens and rainbows. Like, kittens? You got haters like coming after you. It's like, dude, it was kittens. Like, chill. You will risk sounding weird or extreme or religious. In a world that is as skeptical and cynical as ours, it takes courage to speak God. So ask yourself, what are you doing in your life today, this week, this month, to form yourself, to shape yourself into a person of courage. You'll need that if you want to speak God. Speaking God takes vulnerability. Opening up your inner life, whether it's in prayer or conversations with friends, is tricky. It requires, in the full sense of the phrase, bearing your soul. In that text in 2 Corinthians, Paul's idea doesn't originate with him. He says, as it is written. Written where? Paul is actually riffing on a version of Psalm 116 that we don't have in our Bibles, in which the writer is experiencing distress and sorrow to the point of near death. And this writer in the psalm is crying out to God and crying out to his community, saying, I believed, and therefore I have spoken. I am greatly afflicted. You see, to speak God doesn't mean to preach at people. It means opening your heart and your spirit just to share what's inside, to discuss your doubts and your darkness, your struggles and your sorrow with other God seekers and God speakers. That takes vulnerability. What are you doing in your life to shape yourself, form yourself into a person of vulnerability? You'll need it to speak God. Speaking God also takes passion. Now, when you first read that passage in 2 Corinthians, you won't feel the heart, but that is because we are post-Enlightenment Christians. And when we read that phrase, I believe, we naturally assume it is a cognitive belief. That it refers to the doctrines or the dogma that you've learned, that you're speaking out of that knowledge. I've memorized all those things that I was taught in church, and so therefore I'm going to go speak about all those things that I was taught in church. But this is to misunderstand that ancient word. You know something in your head. You believe something in your heart. That ancient word, to believe, the best synonym for that is to belove, not to know. Paul's saying, when we fall in love with God and Jesus and the spiritual life, that will begin to kind of bubble up and spill out of our mouths, which makes sense, really, when you think about it, because we all talk about the things we love. If you don't think that that's true, just go stand outside of a daycare, and like Charlotte will come up and just start thumbing through pictures of what Tyler did this week. You don't care anything about Tyler. You don't want to see his pictures. But she's going to talk about Tyler. Why? Because she loves Tyler. How weird would it be if you had a friend for 5 or 10 years and then one day you just found out that he had a spouse and 3 children? You'd be like, I don't think you love your wife very much. We talk about things that we love. That's just what we do. And so this is what Paul is saying here. Do you believe in God, which is to say, do you love God? Is there a passion for God? Then that should spark a fire on your lips. You know, if we're honest about it, many people don't speak God because we've lost our passion for God. You remember that time when you were 12 or 15, you went to youth camp or whatever that thing was your church did, and you came back and said you were on fire. You know, you'd played the little guitar around the campfire. You were on fire for God. And you think, gosh, I haven't felt that in years. That spark, that thing, that thing that pushed you along, all those years, you haven't felt that in longer than you can remember. What are you doing in your life to nurture that passion for God, to stoke that passion for God? You'll need it if you want to speak God. You know, this conversation can be kind of depressing when I go places and I speak about it, because we all show up for one reason, because we believe that words, indeed sacred words, have the power to change something. That's why we're here. That's why we give up our night, come to a place like this, because you think maybe something that is spoken will change you some way. It's going to hit you in some way. It's going to give you something that you need. And so when a person like me comes into a space like this and says, well, sacred speech and spiritual conversations are dying in the Western world and probably will be dead by the end of my lifetime, good night, God bless, it could be a little depressing. But I want to give you some hope. Linguists talk about something they call comeback languages. You know, there are so many thousands of languages spoken on planet Earth, and every year, for various reasons, genocide, economic reasons, they're snuffed out. They disappear. But every so often, you find what linguists call comeback languages, which refer to languages that were once on the brink of extinction but have since been reborn. The most prominent example, of course, is modern Hebrew, a language that was largely dead, but with the advent of the modern Israeli nation-state has been reborn. There are many other examples. Hawaiian. If any of you have vacation down there, they mahalo you to death. They're doing their best to bring this language back. Catalan, Gaelic. I was reading an article this week about a Native American tongue that's being revived in Louisiana. Comeback languages. One of my favorite stories of a comeback language is the story of Yiddish. You probably won't hear much Yiddish spoken in Charlottesville, I'd imagine, but if you come to my neighborhood in Brooklyn and you go down south in Williamsburg to the Hasidic quarter, you'll hear a lot of these funny little words. Used by European Jews throughout the early 20th century, Yiddish nearly disappeared due in part to the Holocaust, but the tongue saw a revival in the last part of the last century thanks to the efforts of prominent Yiddish speakers and writers. One of the great catapults of this language revival was the work of a man named Isaac Bashevis Singer. He was a Polish-born Jewish writer, and in 1978 he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, even though he only wrote in Yiddish, a dead language, essentially. Well, a journalist asked Singer what any good journalist would ask him: why would you pen books in a dying language? And the author replied, I like ghost stories. And I also believe in resurrection. And I read that story again coming down here on the airplane, and every time I read it, I have a thought. I think, Isaac, you're not the only one. You see, you invited me here not just to talk about theology, but to talk about Christian theology. To talk about a tradition that is built around a particular event, which is a resurrection. There is something deep in the bones, the connective tissue of our faith that says these things that are dying, well, they can come back to life. So speaking God, yes, it is in massive decline in America, but I do not believe that all is lost. I believe we can revive the vocabulary of faith in the 21st century, and that is my prayer for every audience I speak to. That people who walk into this place, chattering with each other, bearing that image of God, will walk out and decide to become courageous, vulnerable, passionate God speakers again. But do me a favor, please don't do it while the movie is playing. Thank you. Interns with mics. Yes. Oh, I think we have mics over here. Here we go.
So if you've got a question, raise your hand, and Maddie and Neely have the
That's on, I
power
think.
to call upon you. Should we start over here?
All right.
As someone who has hymns ringing in my head periodically, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how much does music amplify words, and how often can it distract from the words? How important is it in conveying all sorts of things, but obviously faith?
I think what music is doing, it's like comparing poetry to prose. When you compare spoken word to the sung word. It has a different function. It's like parallel tracks that a train runs on. It strikes you in a different way. I can say something to you if everybody walked in here and said, and I said, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, it wouldn't become the #1 spoken word in all of history, right? But it is the #1 most sung song. There is something about when it's paired with a melody that engages our brains in a way that allows us to take in that message. It kind of moves our spirit while also giving us information. I mean, I think that and good speaking can often do this as well, but I think music, one of the things music does well is it can bring together information and inspiration in a way that the spoken word cannot always. It also is absorbed by our brains in a certain way. As everybody knows this is true. You create a song for something, you're more likely to remember it than if you just memorize the words itself. So there are ways that I think it interacts with our brains. I don't know, when you say, could it distract from it? I don't know. I think that puts these tracks in competition with each other. I don't know that I would say, should you speak it or should you sing it? They're doing two different things when you're sort of engaging in that way. Does that make sense? I'm going to let somebody else choose. I'm not going to be the guy.
I remember, excuse me. I remember one time reading about a man. When somebody said, "How are you?" he said, "I'm blessed." And I thought, what an incredibly beautiful answer. I've never had the guts to say that when somebody says, "How are you?" But that's how I feel.
I like to say a little word about that word blessed, because that one of the things that I talk about in my book is this process of language transformation. All language changes over time. The only way that you can make a language come back is to engage in wordplay. All words, including the vocabulary of faith, all languages change over time. Linguists don't agree on everything. They're probably like college professors. They don't agree on much. But they do agree on this. Every language will either change or it will die. Languages are constantly evolving, and so too the language of faith. We look at many words in the Bible, and you find them evolving even in the text. The way they're used changes from early Hebrew Bible to late Hebrew Bible to the New Testament, and we're already coming up with new ways of using that word by the time we get into the Christian history. The word blessed is one of those words that's changed in a way that I think is not as helpful, and it's not your example. Your example is fine, it's beautiful, it does not bother me at all. But the way that it's often used, particularly in social media, #blessed, it tends to be a symbol of privilege. People will say, look at my Lexus I got wrapped in this Christmas bow, #blessed. Look at me and my adoring husband on our 10-year anniversary in Punta Cana, #blessed. Which sort of insinuates something about people who could never buy that Lexus or whose marriages have disintegrated long ago. If that's how God loves, does God love me? And yet there is something, particularly in the text, you find the earliest usage of the word blessed in the Hebrew scripture does have a sort of materialistic feel to it. God blesses with things in the Hebrew Bible. So it's sort of part of the story, but not the whole story. So when people say, for example, they hold their newborn baby and say they are blessed, that is the truth. It is not the whole truth. Because what about the person who's had 6 miscarriages? What does that say? Does God not love them? Does God not pour out blessings on them? So I think that we have to rediscover the kind of blessing, not just that's in the Hebrew text, we're pretty good at that because we live in a capitalistic society, but the kind of blessedness that we find in the New Testament. Of course, you find a reordering of blessed where it becomes not external but internal, not materialistic but spiritual. Blessed are the meek, and blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. How many times are you like, boop, persecuted today, #blessed? Nobody's doing that, right? But as a result, because we don't speak the word blessed in those contexts, our minds then are not attuned to it. So somebody at the end of that cubicle on the end of your row speaks that kind word to you when you needed it most, and you don't stop to think that, wow, I'm blessed. Just a feeling of peace in the midst of chaos. You don't go, wow, I'm blessed. You get a raise and you think, man, I'm blessed. And so I think that we do need a reimagination of that word. But it's interesting that you brought that word up. That was just sort of a rabbit trail, but yes?
Just a question about imagination, and thank you for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
The decline of everyday speech about God, or God's speech in everyday life, certainly convincing from what you've said. I'm just thinking about when speech also, God's speech begins to disappear from the canon of a culture's imagination. What happens then to everyday speech? So I'm thinking of the example of, two books written in the 17th century. One is John Owen's multi-volume work on the Holy Spirit, which a few today still read. The other is a book called Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which has been translated into almost as many languages as the Bible and is still read today. One was in one sense, its everyday experience translated into the words of imagination, and they invented a certain Western canon of imagination, and and Owens hasn't. So, what's the role of the Christian writer, the word artist, to help restore our everyday speech, because we can draw from that, that canon of imagination?
Yeah. I think if you're serious about theological imagination, you should be constantly doing historical and cultural exegesis. In other words, you should be saying, what are the words that were spoken, the texts that were canonized in our past that have shaped me in a particular way? A lot of the things we think are Christian, for example, are just capitalism. In His Steps, or all of these old books that people used to read about, like, well, if you follow Jesus, man, you're going to have a great marriage and a wonderful business. And there are these kinds of things that have creeped in, and if you're not doing cultural or historical exegesis, you just sort of take it for granted, like this is just the plain meaning of the text. This is just the way. This is what this means. And I think that we should constantly be doing cultural and historical exegesis, in addition to doing biblical exegesis, listening to a wide range of thinkers, not just like crusty Western white men. You start to realize that if you could read the parable of the prodigal son one way in the West, but you read it a little bit differently in places like Africa or Russia or Eastern Europe. And most of us, I think, are not seeking out those resources either. So there is not an acknowledgement. There's not an acknowledgement, by and large, in Western Christian communities that there is any type of adjective on the front of our version of Christianity. It's like, oh yeah, that's black theology, and that's liberation theology, and that's feminist theology, and I just do theology, right? And so we're not oftentimes, now we do this in the academy, certainly, but not in most churches, where we're asking the question, am I doing white, Western, patriarchal theology? And how would I bring that cultural expression of theology into conversation with other forms of theology so that I can achieve a higher consciousness of these ideas? I think most lay people, most kind of regular old-fashioned Christians are not doing that. But you're bringing up, I think, a fantastic point. Yes?
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking with us today.
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think personally one of the reasons that I'm most afraid to speak about my religious beliefs is a fear of not being respectful to people of different beliefs. For example, speaking to someone of a different religion or who is agnostic or an atheist. And just to give an example to clarify, if I am walking off a bus one day and I want to say to the bus driver, have a blessed day rather than have a good day, I'm afraid that might offend them in some way, or they may not be on the same wavelength. So how do you recommend going about that hesitancy or that reluctance?
Yeah, so when I talk about speaking God, particularly in cultures that have been steeped in or shaped by evangelicalism, the natural assumption is he's talking about evangelism. Or he's talking about performing these acts of becoming like a linguistic kamikaze pilot, where you're just going, have a blessed day, and I don't even know this bus driver, right? I don't know if they wanted to have that conversation with me. I don't know what they believe. I don't know if that word is triggering for them. But I feel somehow like I've done something by just saying it. That's not what I'm promoting. What I'm talking about is intentionally finding people, a diverse group of people, in those spaces where you live, work, and play, who are also seeking or speaking God, and saying, hey, could we get together and wrestle with some of these things? And then when you're in those spaces, seeking first to understand and only second to be understood, and asking more questions than you're giving answers. So what I'm not advocating for is this kind of linguistic drive-by acts of speaking God. Like the drive-by acts of speaking God, I think, make very little difference in terms of shaping culture. I think intentional conversation in communities where they're had at eye level, and you know the person, it's a safe space where that person knows that they can really bring forward their full self, that's a totally different type of thing. That's the thing that I'm hoping people will begin doing. Which is what people, by the way, used to do all the time when we actually lived in communities and we didn't just park our cars there, right? Now it's like your coffee shop's in one neighborhood and your favorite restaurant's in one neighborhood and you work in one neighborhood and you live in one neighborhood, and by the time you get back to that neighborhood, you're too exhausted to talk to anybody anyway, right? It's not like your farm is next to Joe's farm, which is next to so-and-so's farm, and you're kind of all living life together and you're working out these things. What I hope will happen is that we can create space, even in the digital age, even in a disconnected society, where we can have intentional conversations and let our lives brush up against each other, and do it, by the way, in diverse communities. That doesn't mean don't just go down to the Methodist church where you go, where everybody is like you, and you're 40-something, so you ask only 40-somethings, and you're white, so you only ask white people, and you're man, so you only get the men's group. And what I'm saying is to get people of different ethnicities, different genders, different sexual orientations, who come from different socioeconomic strata. Because it's interesting if I'm a Instagram famous and I come into this group and I say, oh yeah, I said this today, #blessed, aren't you proud? Then a person who will never likely achieve that level of wealth can say, let me tell you how that affects me. And then you say, oh wow, we need to reimagine this word in a way that's wider, that can encompass everyone. Or somebody can say, let me say as a woman, how that hits me, how that affects me, how that generates pain in me. As a gay person, let me tell you the way that you use that, what it does to me. I think that's how you create these communities where words can come alive again. If you ever read, there's a book by C.S. Lewis called Studies in Words, and he likens this process to the growth of a tree, where the trunk is kind of the central idea of the word, right? So you might have sin. Sin is a great example of this. Sin really shouldn't be that controversial of a word. Everybody who has enough sense to come in out of the rain understands that there is a difference between is and ought. You look around this country and you see the way things are, you see the is of this country, most people agree that's not the way it ought to be, in some way. What do you call that chasm between is and ought? That's sort of the trunk of the tree that Christian theology sort of names as sin. But we've reimagined that in various branches. Early Judaism reimagined sin primarily as a stain. It was something you got on you, you had to wash off, but it would often come back. Late Temple Judaism imagined sin primarily as a weight. Another branch comes off the tree, a weight. It was a heaviness, and it was communal, not individualistic, right? It was not everybody got their own high priest. It wasn't like you get a high priest, and you get a high priest, and you get a Day of Atonement. No. We do this all as a community. We come together. The high priest brings the scapegoat forward. You remember this ritual? Lays his hands to symbolically take the weight of sin that's gotten so heavy on the community and put on the scapegoat, and they chase it out of the community. And with that, it symbolically says the weight has been lifted, but it's going to lower again, so we got to come back and do this again next year. Jesus comes along and Paul comes along, but the world has changed. With the rise of the Roman Empire, you have early financial markets that arise, and they imagine sin primarily as a debt. Paul says the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. If you put Paul in a time machine and send him back, the high priest will not have any idea what Paul is talking about, because that language is just not present at that time. Jesus even imagines it, by the way, in reverse. He says, well, if there's this like cosmic bank account and we can debit out of it, maybe we can deposit into it. So he says, store up for yourself treasures in heaven that will not decay but will shine in the age to come. This is a very new way of talking about kind of sin and righteousness. But it's another branch on the tree. Today, there are all kinds of branches that have come off that tree. You may go into an evangelical church and they say, you've got a sin problem. Well, like problem solution language is not exactly first century language. They're reimagining things. And each of these is getting at something that is true, right? If somebody says, Jesus didn't use this clinical language, that people say you're sick. Jesus only in one would say it's a Gospel of Luke or something, he says he came for the sick and not the well don't need a doctor. Except for that, I don't think Jesus really talks about sin in any kind of way of talking about sickness. But a sickness, in some ways, that's true. Sin is just something like, it just comes into our lives. Like you wake up one day and you're like, I don't need to be doing that. What happened? It's just like you woke up with a cold. On the other hand, it's sort of a limiting metaphor for sin, right? Because if you're sick, who's responsible? Nobody. But like if you're a racist, you're responsible. If you're a murderer, you're responsible. So the sickness metaphor is not really limiting. As I said before, it is the truth, but it's not the whole truth, so help you God. So what we need is the whole tree when we come to these theological words, where we're allowing culture, lives, different experiences to kind of prune these trees and give us different ways of understanding them over time. I don't even remember what the original question was. I am so sorry. Man, I am just like, brrr. I don't know if any of this is helpful or if I'm answering your questions.
Thanks very much for being with us. Thanks very much for being with us this evening. I have a statement and a question, which partly is modified humorously because I was handed the mic right as the previous question was very similar to the one I was going to ask. First of all, some of us have spent the last bunch of months and weeks mounting a production of Leonard Bernstein's Mass here last weekend. And it's a piece which is in Bernstein's own acknowledgement about what he called the crisis of the 20th century, crisis of faith. And in your case, where you're talking about the death and rebirth of sacred speech, in the piece, he's really interested, I think, in something very similar, the death and rebirth of sacred ritual and how that plays out. He tears down a mass and basically in order to somehow reaffirm and rebuild it for a modern age, kind of a Nietzschean formulation. So that part I mentioned in part just to, if you're not familiar with it, I hope you can take a look at it because I think your own themes resonate a lot with what he's talking about.
If I could interrupt you,
before the question.
I give a triad in the book. I give a triad of kind of formulas that all basically say the same thing, and I think that culturally, when we're talking about spiritual formation and even the survival of religious institutions, we get hung up, depending on our own pedigree, in one of these phases. I think of it as construction, deconstruction, reconstruction. Now, if you're a fundamentalist Christian, if you're a super conservative evangelical, construction, that's warm bathwater for you. You love it. You were taught a certain way, you memorized all the answers, don't mess with my answers. You see your job on planet Earth as guarding that construction, not letting anybody attack that construction, right? Circle the wagons. Don't challenge this doctrine, don't challenge this notion, because I don't want you to poke at my house of cards. Everything is sacrosanct, don't touch it. Construction, that's you. Liberal folks, progressive folks, tend to get caught up in the deconstruction phase. They get sort of hung up there. They just tear it all down. And everything, there's a caveat for everything. They're tearing down all, they kick the sacred cows, and they're burning it all down. And then one day they're sitting in a pile of ash, and they're like some kind of post-Christian cynic, and they can't use God's speech at all because everything's too triggering for them. What I think you have to have is that third step. Deconstruction is incredibly helpful. You have to critique these things because every construct is culturally conditioned, so you have to constantly deconstruct. But there has to be enough courage within the community to reconstruct into something better. And I think most people don't have the time, patience, desire to get to that third stage. By the time they get into deconstruction, they throw up their hands and they're done. Anyway, I'm sorry. Your next question.
No, that's fantastic. Well, very quickly. I mean, I think so. One of the reasons we do pieces like this is it enables us to speak in a various way, including in the academy. So, just to build on the last question about how to speak in a pluralistic, society and community, any thoughts about focusing that to our more immediate context, which is a public university, which also raises questions of what is the proper context for sacred speech in a public institution?
That's a super hard question, because I don't want to step on any toes at the University of Virginia and what they do or don't expect from you. I think my vision for pluralism in America is that each person would become more of whatever that thing is that they are than they've ever been in their life, and that they would find freedom to be that thing. So it doesn't mean that we're so comfortable with this like melting pot language, which is a really terrible metaphor. It ends up just being everybody act like white people is what that ends up being. Or everybody act like white Christians. That's the melting pot. That's where it leads you. Instead, saying, how do we nurture that if you are African American or African, if you are atheist or Hindu, if you are Christian, how can you be more that than you've ever been before in a space like this, and to be in conversation with other people, to bring your whole self forward? I think we're not very good at that in pluralistic contexts, and I think oftentimes public universities are even worse at that, which is why a lot of people come to public universities and they leave a little bit disoriented. Who am I? You want to challenge that as well. But you should. I remember when I went to Emory, I'd come from a seminary that was confessional, which is, in some ways, was kind of limiting. I mean, they have a way of thinking, and they teach you to think that way and argue for that way, defend that way. And it was Baptist, it was conservative Baptist. And then I went to this United Methodist seminary that wasn't confessional, it was contextual. And so we could sit around a table and they would say, who in this room believes in a traditional notion of atonement? Somebody would raise their hand, they'd say, explain it to us. You're not shamed for it, but explain it to us. You would explain it. And then they would say, okay, could a woman in this room explain maybe a feminist critique of that notion of atonement? And somebody would say, is there a non-Westerner in this room? How would Bart respond to that? And before you knew it, you were starting to come to an understanding of this thing that you'd never really even conceived of before. And I think that's really beautiful if you can do it well. But I think in many contexts, pluralism really means you create some kind of tolerant amalgam that everybody kind of fits in and everybody else just sort of shuts up or feels weird about who they are. And in public universities, I think that we're probably not well served by that. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else. It makes sense in here, but I don't know if it made sense when it came out here. Anyway. Yeah.
Jonathan, we're going to let this be the last question.
Last question. Okay.
The pressure's on.
All right.
I think it's so many people have talked about this the difficulty that we all face. You were just talking about it, and particularly in a public university, where there's a desire and a fear of offending and hurting other people. And in the current context, that's harmful in a lot of ways because we end up not talking about anything that matters. You can run away from it. And this is an example of that. But I thought one of the things that you said, which isn't often talked about when we talk about bringing our beliefs to the fore, is that you said one of the challenges is that we don't have the passion. It may not just be fear of offending, but that maybe we haven't confronted ourselves. Well, have we lost the passion? And it goes to your question about, having all the truth in the box versus deconstruction. But I think this is what I'd like you to comment on, one of the challenges of not having the passion is that we may be confused about our conviction. Like, what do we think about it when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life? So how do we say something like that in a loving way and ask ourselves, do we have the passion to really say, when we look at our brother or sister, I love you and I want to share this wonderful relationship with you?
Yeah.
I think a lot of us are missing that passion.
Yes, so let me say, we'll do a little cultural exegesis together. As post-Enlightenment Westerners, we love answers. We are addicted to answers. So you take John 14:6, you're like, somebody tell me what this means. and then I'm going to go to a church that can become base camp to train me for how to tell somebody else what this means. I'm not open to hearing if they have a different understanding of what John 14:6 means. I just want to convince them that they're wrong, I'm right, and they should believe like I believe, so I can bring them back to church, and then we can train them to go out and do the same thing. That's sort of the process. It's a process that was born out in part of a reaction to an anti-intellectualism that was rampant in Christian circles in the mid-20th century. You remember the Mark Knoll's famous, the scandal of the evangelical mind. The opening line is, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there's not one. And so we started trying to beef it up. And what did we do? We got together, we started publishing these books on apologetics to give everybody, make a case for Christ and a case for creation and a case for this and a case for that and answers that demand a verdict. We started to sort of think about that, and we just all fell in love with this kind of hyper-rationalistic, answer-centric way of being Christian. I would suggest as a conversation point that perhaps following Jesus is not as concerned about having all of the right answers as it is falling in love with and committing to the right questions. Now, if what I ask you to do is to go out and argue a skeptic to that your interpretation of John 14:6 is right, boy, that is a difficult task. I don't have an answer for that. But if what I say to you is that speaking God means that at the heart of that, there are some really important questions. And because you're not infallible and I'm not infallible, and neither are any of the commentaries that we've read are infallible, maybe we should go in dialogue with other people about what that means. Maybe they won't be convinced. Maybe I'll be convinced. I think that when you look at the Christian life, what you find is an obsession with questions. Not so much an obsession with answers. Now, you do find in late 20th century white evangelicalism in America in particular, you find an obsession with answers. I don't find you find that in the Scripture. When you read the New Testament, you find that Jesus is asked over 300 questions. He answers 18 of them. He then goes on to ask 120 some odd more of them. Jesus does not seem so wound up about how do I go out and tell everybody about the right answer. It just doesn't. It's just not. I think when you read the New Testament, you find it so much more difficult than that and richer than that. Jesus is really giving people the types of questions he hopes will nag at them and haunt them all of their lives. So I think that's maybe a different way of thinking about faith, and it means baptizing questions as well as answers, and also that holy space between the question and the answer. The ancient rabbis had a saying, God is in the wrestling. Maybe the place where we meet God is not in the act of convincing someone to believe John 14:6 means the thing I thought it believed. Maybe God is found in that space where we're just engaging each other with our whole selves, exchanging ideas and experiences and wrestling with those questions that we both believe really, really matter.
Well, we're going to make space for one more question. Surprise.
Oh, gosh. Here we go.
The Project on Live Theology as co-host, Charles
gosh.
Marsh has a question for you.
Oh, gosh.
One advantage of being married to the organizer. Thank you, Jonathan. That was beautiful. A beautiful lecture, and word event, and I also see a fellow Baptist minister's son in your eloquence and passion, and I just wanted to sort of offer you a slightly different perspective on the on your final moving kind of admonition to speak and to recover the courage and the conviction to speak. And you know, it pertains to you know, not the absence of God speak, but to the times when the language itself and the words themselves become profaned and eviscerated and cheapened to the point of undermining the mystery and the power that animated the faith historically and throughout tradition. And you know, I think, for example, of someone I've written about. We all bring our favorite heroes to the to the conversation of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in prison in 1944, kind of surveying the ruins of German Christendom and the complicity of German Christians in the rise of Hitlerism and the pursuit to create a world without Jews. And he says a minister, a speaker, a writer, someone whose words come to more than 16 volumes in the collected papers, that the time of words is over. And perhaps now our witness must be limited to two things, prayer and righteous action. And he also spoke about the redemptive power of silence. And silence is a very precarious admonition. I mean, it's one that ought not to be ventured easily, because there's the silence of the oppressed, there's the silence of those whose voices have been muted, and silence of the bystander. But there's also a holy silence. And I have a slightly different response to your survey. I kind of think, well, that could be, there could be aspects of that prove generative in the long haul. I mean, Paul Tillich once said that Americans should all sort of agree to a 10-year moratorium on religious language in the public square because it had become such a cacophony and this kind of all God all the time noisiness of religious talk made it impossible to have those kinds of rich, deep conversations, let's say within the Christian tradition, where different speech about God, different ways of speaking about God, Jesus Christ, and the church often, produce dramatically, cataclysmically different kind of social consequences. So silence sometimes the best response to this landscape that you've so eloquently, observed for us.
Well, I would say, first of all, I'm inclined to agree with just about anything you say, because I do love your work. But I would say yes. The answer is yes. I wrote in the book before this book I devoted a whole chapter to silence. So what I think I'm getting at in this is one way. I mean, you could say, what about incarnation? In other words, you could say, well, you're just talking about speaking grace, but aren't we called to be grace or to embody grace? The answer is yes. Yes, all of those things. So I think I'm getting at one piece of this, but what I'm not saying, what I don't want is to create some sort of linguistic idolatry, where it's like really the Christian life in some way is just distilled down to the act of speaking. There is, I think, a time for silence, and in many ways there is an impulse, again, to do some cultural exegesis on myself. Westerners, when we want to connect with God, we make noise, by and large, right? We preach a sermon, we pray a verbal prayer, we have a spiritual conversation, we sing a song or a hymn. Eastern expressions of Christianity often do the opposite. And you do find both of those things in the scripture. It's make a joyful noise to the Lord, be still and know that I am God. And I think of those things as like chest day and leg day. Right? Like sometimes it's like, nice pecs, you've got chicken legs, right? You're doing this and you need to do this. And there is a time for silence. Totally agree with that. And in some cases even now, there are a lot of people, I think, if we could just put a moratorium on God speak, we'd be much better off.
Well, thank you. There's so much more I want.
Yes, we're gonna chat all evening. Yes.
So as we conclude our rich time together, with great thanks to Jonathan Merritt and to you for your questions and your thoughts, I want you to know that the books table is out this door here. I think Jonathan will stay here. There are signed copies But if you'd like a special
Or
inscription,
personalized or something.
Personalized.
I'm happy to do that.
uh,
If you want that.
a cartoon.
Yes, if you
he'll be
want a
here.
drawing.
Yes, and so, and I again invite you later to visit theologicalhorizons.org and also check out the wonderful project on Live Theology. So thank you for being with us tonight, and thanks again to our speaker, Jonathan Merritt.